Welcome back to Hardball. Another day of testimony in the Scooter Libby trial. Former New York Times reporter Judy Miller took the stand today. The first time she testified publicly against Libby, who was the source she chose to protect, leading her to spend several weeks, many weeks, in jail. Hardball's David Schuster standing by at the courthouse. David, I was shook today to hear that Scooter Libby told Judy Miller that it was the vice president's inquiry about a uranium deal in Africa that led to Joe Wilson's trip. This is the first time we've heard out of the vice president's office, even secondhand, an admission, a confession, that that trip was because of a question raised by the Veep, not because Mrs. Wilson, Valerie Plame, thought her husband needed a junket.
Right. I mean, it was the missing piece of the puzzle that the vice president's office has been loath to acknowledge these last 3 years, and that certainly Scooter Libby has not wanted to sort of come out in this trial. But it did happen when Judy Miller was testifying about a conversation with Scooter Libby in June of 2003, and she testified that Scooter Libby brought up Joe and Valerie Wilson. And it was during this testimony when Judy Miller said that she was told by Libby about the genesis of Joe Wilson's trip, and that it was the vice president who had asked the CIA about an intelligence report that Iraq was seeking uranium from Niger in 2002, and that according to Miller, Libby told her that the CIA then followed up with Joe Wilson, but that Libby was also adamant, according to Miller, in saying the vice president's office didn't know anything about this trip. The vice president's office didn't get a report from the CIA. It was the fault of the CIA. And Chris, what was so remarkable is the glimpse that Judy Miller's testimony offered us again about the extent to which the vice president's office wanted to blame everybody else for the faulty intelligence. They were blaming the CIA for not getting back to the vice president's office. They were blaming the State Department and the Energy Department for having a footnote in a report that expressed the dissension about aluminum tubes were for, and according to Miller, Libby said it's not our fault that we didn't see this in this report. It was always somebody else's fault, and it goes to the idea, Chris, that even after the war had begun, the vice president's office was adamant about suggesting that everybody else was unanimous in agreeing that Iraq was trying to expand a nuclear program.
Well, we also know that the vice president spent 6 different trips over at Langley at CIA headquarters pushing for evidence to justify a war. And I know that George Tenet, the CIA director at the time, when I asked him, how could the vice president have triggered a trip to send somebody to Africa with all the money that cost and not got a report back from the CIA? And George Tenet said to me to my face, ask him, ask Cheney. So I hope the prosecutors get into this question just for the national history here, just so we know how we got in this war, whether the vice president ever got a report back or Scooter Libby protected him from that report, or I don't know what, how we read this. How can a vice president ask a question, have a trip undertaken at great expense, and never get a report back? Let's find out. I want the answer.
Well, and unfortunately, Chris, it's not germane for the prosecutors, but again, it shows the extent to which the vice president's office wanted to blame the CIA completely. I mean, Judy Miller, when she's talking about this crucial conversation with Scooter Libby, and she says that Scooter Libby told her, nobody from the CIA came to the White House and said, Mr. President, this intelligence is not correct, this is not right. So there you have Scooter Libby spinning Judy Miller in 2003, and yet we know, and the public knows, that the CIA, in fact, stripped this intelligence reference out of a presidential speech in the fall of 2002 because they said the intelligence about Iraq seeking uranium was not accurate. And so there you have the vice president's office still spinning that everybody agreed on this after the war had started. But Chris, back to the point about the trial, the reason that Judy Miller's testimony is so significant is yet again there is evidence that Scooter Libby knew about Valerie Wilson before the date in which he testified that he said he first learned about Valerie Wilson, and that's what's going to get him in trouble.
More evidence for the prosecution. Thank you very much, David Schuster at the courthouse.